The dust swirled around Margaret Lawson's worn boots as she stood outside the white clapboard church in Columbia, California, her hands trembling as she clutched the worn fabric of her best dress, knowing that inside those doors her entire world was about to collapse. It was the summer of 1878, and the gold rush had long since faded from this Sierra Nevada foothill town, leaving behind a collection of honest folk who clung to their faith and their judgments with equal fervor. Margaret had lived here all her 21 years, the daughter of a miner who had died 3 years prior in a cave-in, leaving her to work as a seamstress to support herself and her ailing mother. She had been a good girl, everyone said so, until Daniel came to town with his silver tongue and empty promises. He had been a traveling merchant, handsome and charming, and Margaret had been lonely. When he disappeared 2 months after his arrival, she had cried for a week. When she realized she was carrying his child another month later, she had cried for 2 more. Now, at 4 months along, her condition was becoming impossible to hide, and she had come to Reverend Thompson seeking guidance, seeking mercy, seeking any kind of help the church could offer. The meeting had lasted less than 15 minutes. Margaret walked down Main Street with her head held as high as she could manage, even though tears streamed freely down her cheeks. The Reverend's words echoed in her mind like the tolling of a funeral bell. Shameful. Sinful. No place for her in God's house until she repented and gave the child up to a proper Christian family. The other women of the congregation would be informed. She would not be welcome at services or social gatherings. She was, effectively, cast out. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she made her way past the Wells Fargo office and the general store, aware of the eyes following her, the whispers already beginning. Columbia was a small town, and news traveled faster than a telegraph message. By nightfall, everyone would know. By morning, she would likely lose her seamstress work. Who would want their dresses made by a fallen woman? She barely noticed when she collided with someone outside the livery stable, so lost was she in her misery. "Whoa there, miss. You all right?" Large, calloused hands steadied her, and Margaret looked up into the concerned face of a man she recognized, but had never formally met. Ethan Foster was a rancher who lived about 5 miles outside of town, bringing cattle to market every few months. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His eyes were a striking gray blue, and right now they were filled with genuine concern as he looked down at her tear-stained face. "I'm fine," Margaret said automatically, trying to pull away, but her voice broke on the words. "You don't look fine." His voice was gentle, a surprising contrast to his rugged appearance. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with the kind of solid, dependable presence that came from years of hard work and honest living. "Please, I just need to get home." Margaret wiped at her face with the back of her hand, aware that she must look a fright. Ethan didn't release her arm, though his grip was careful, respectful. "Did someone hurt you? Because if they did, I'd be happy to have a word with them." Despite everything, Margaret almost smiled at the protective tone in his voice. "No one hurt me. Well, not physically." She shouldn't say more. She should just leave. But something about his kind eyes made her want to unburden herself, if only for a moment. "The church just made it clear I'm no longer welcome," his brow furrowed. "What could you possibly have done to deserve that? You're Margaret Lawson, right? The seamstress. I heard you made the dress for the mayor's daughter's wedding last spring. Everyone said it was the finest work they'd ever seen." The fact that he knew who she was, that he remembered something good about her, made the tears fall faster. "I've made a terrible mistake, Mr. Foster. I'm going to have a baby and there's no husband, and the father is long gone, and now I've lost everything." She hadn't meant to tell him. The words just tumbled out, and once they started, she couldn't stop them. The Reverend says I'm sinful and shameful, and he's right. I was foolish and stupid, and now I'll lose my work and probably my home, and I don't know what to do. My mother needs medicine, and I can't afford it on my own, and soon I won't be able to work at all, and what kind of life can I give this baby when we're starving in the street? Ethan listened to her entire outpouring without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each word. When she finally ran out of breath, he was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider carefully before speaking. The Reverend said you were sinful and shameful. His voice had taken on a hard edge. Margaret nodded miserably. He's right. I was weak and foolish, and now I'm paying the price. No. The word came out firm and decisive. You made a mistake, maybe, trusted the wrong person, but that doesn't make you shameful. And it sure as hell doesn't give the church the right to cast you out when you need help most. Margaret stared at him in surprise. In all her agonizing over the past weeks, she had never once considered that the church might be wrong. She had been raised to believe that the Reverend spoke with divine authority, that his judgments reflected God's will. Ethan seemed to realize he had spoken strongly, and his expression softened. I'm sorry, Miss Lawson. I don't mean to add to your troubles. It's just that I believe God is supposed to be about love and forgiveness, not about kicking people when they're down. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. My mother found herself in a similar situation before I was born. She was 16 and alone, and her family turned her out. If it hadn't been for my father finding her on the road to Sacramento, half-starved and desperate, I wouldn't be here today. He married her on the spot, and they had 30 good years together before she passed. Margaret's breath caught. Your father wasn't your real father. He was the only father I ever knew or needed, Ethan said firmly. And he used to say that God doesn't make mistakes. Every child is a blessing, no matter how it comes into the world. Every person deserves compassion and second chances. The words struck Margaret like a physical blow, but in the best possible way. God doesn't make mistakes. She pressed a hand to her still small belly, feeling the first flutter of something other than despair. Maybe this baby, her baby, wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was just a life, innocent and deserving of love. Thank you for saying that, she whispered. You've given me more kindness in 5 minutes than I've received in 5 weeks. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, a decision being made. Miss Lawson, I know this is going to sound crazy, and you have every right to tell me to mind my own business, but I have a proposal for you. Margaret's heart stuttered. Surely he didn't mean what she thought he meant. I have a ranch outside of town. It's not fancy, but it's profitable enough. I've got a good herd, a sturdy house, and land that produces well. I've been thinking lately that it's a lonely place for one person. He took off his hat, turning it in his hands in a gesture that seemed almost nervous. What I'm trying to say, and saying poorly, is that I'd be honored if you'd consider marrying me. Margaret's jaw dropped. Mr. Foster, you can't possibly be serious. You don't even know me. I know you're a hard worker. I know you care for your sick mother. I know you're brave enough to face your troubles head-on instead of running away. And I know you need help, and I'm in a position to offer it. He met her eyes steadily. I'm not offering out of pity, Miss Lawson. I'm offering because I think we could help each other. You need security and protection. I need companionship and someone to share the work of the ranch. And your baby needs a father and a name. But you don't love me, Margaret said weakly, even as hope began to unfurl in her chest like a flower reaching for the sun. Not yet, Ethan admitted with surprising honesty. But I think I could, and I think maybe you could come to care for me too, given time. My parents started with less, and they built something real and lasting, We could do the same." Margaret looked at this man, this stranger who was offering her salvation when everyone else had turned their backs. He had kind eyes and gentle hands and a good heart, if his words were any indication. What other choice did she have? Where else could she turn? "Why would you do this?" she asked, needing to understand. "Why would you take on another man's child and the scandal that comes with it?" Ethan put his hat back on, and his expression was utterly sincere. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I remember my mother's stories of how scared she was, how certain she was that her life was over. Because I believe that God doesn't make mistakes, and that includes you and your baby." He extended his hand to her. "What do you say, Miss Lawson? Will you marry me?" Margaret looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face, then at the church behind her where she had been rejected. She thought about her mother, about the baby growing inside her, about the future that had seemed so bleak just an hour ago. And she thought about Ethan Foster's words, "God doesn't make mistakes." She placed her hand in his. "Yes, Mr. Foster, I'll marry you." His smile transformed his face, making him almost handsome. "Ethan, if we're getting married, you should probably call me Ethan." "Margaret," she replied, and felt the smallest smile tug at her own lips. "Or Maggie, if you prefer." "Maggie suits you," Ethan said, and there was a warmth in his voice that made her cheeks flush. "Now we should probably figure out the practical matters. When would you want to do this?" "I know most brides want time to plan, but given the circumstances—" "As soon as possible," Margaret said firmly. "The sooner I'm a married woman, the less talk there will be, and my mother needs to know she'll be taken care of." Ethan nodded. "There's a justice of the peace 2 towns over in Sonora who owes me a favor. We could ride over tomorrow if you're willing. Bring your mother too. She should be there to see you married." The tears started again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. "You would do that?" "Take on both of us. A man takes care of his family," Ethan said simply. "And as of tomorrow, you'll both be my family. I have plenty of room at the ranch, and your mother will have a comfortable place to rest and recover." He paused. "I won't lie to you, Maggie. Ranch life is hard work. The house needs a woman's touch, and there's always cooking and cleaning and 100 other chores. But you'll never go hungry, and you'll never be without a roof over your head. And I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure you and your baby are safe and provided for." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of fear and anxiety that had been pulled so tight she had forgotten it was there. "I'm a good worker, Ethan. I won't be a burden. I can sew and cook and clean, and once the baby comes, I'll still pull my weight." "I'm not worried about that," Ethan assured her. "But right now, you look like you've been through the ringer. Why don't I walk you home? We can tell your mother the news, and then I'll go make the arrangements for tomorrow." They walked through town together, and Margaret was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Mrs. Henderson from the dry goods store actually crossed the street to avoid them. Mr. Yates, who had commissioned 3 shirts from Margaret just last week, suddenly found the contents of his shop window utterly fascinating. The rejection stung, but with Ethan's steady presence beside her, it didn't hurt quite as much as it might have. "Ignore them," Ethan said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Small minds make for small judgments. Anyone worth knowing will judge you by your character, not your circumstances." Margaret's mother, Sarah Lawson, was dozing in her rocking chair when they arrived at the small house Margaret rented on the edge of town. She woke when they entered, her thin face brightening when she saw her daughter, then filling with curiosity when she noticed the tall rancher behind her. "Mama," Margaret said, kneeling beside her mother's chair and taking her frail hands. "I have news. This is Ethan Foster. He's asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. We're going to be married tomorrow in Sonora, and then we're all moving to his ranch." Sarah's eyes widened and she looked from her daughter to Ethan and back again. Tomorrow. But Margaret, you barely know this man, and what about your condition? Does he know? He knows everything, Mama, Margaret said softly. He's willing to take us both in and give the baby his name. He's offering us a home and security. Sarah studied Ethan with the sharp eyes of a mother protecting her child. Why would you do this, Mr. Foster? What do you gain from taking on a pregnant woman and her sickly mother? Ethan met her gaze without flinching. I gain a wife and a family, Mrs. Lawson. I've been alone too long and Maggie needs help. It seems to me that God puts people in each other's paths for a reason. Maybe this is meant to be. And what if you come to resent her? Sarah asked bluntly. What if you tire of caring for another man's child? Then I wouldn't be much of a man, would I? Ethan replied. Mrs. Lawson, my own father raised me knowing I wasn't his blood, and he never once made me feel less than wholly loved. If he could do that for my mother's child, I can do the same for Maggie's. A child is a blessing, not a burden. That's what I believe. Sarah's stern expression softened and she squeezed her daughter's hands. Margaret, this is your choice, but I think Mr. Foster is a good man and good men are rare. If you want to marry him, you have my blessing. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again. It seemed like that was all she did lately, cry. But these were better tears, the kind that came from hope instead of despair. Thank you, Mama. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of activity. Ethan left to make arrangements for the trip to Sonora, promising to return at dawn with a wagon to transport them. Margaret and her mother packed their belongings, which didn't amount to much after years of scraping by. Margaret carefully wrapped her sewing supplies and the few pieces of her mother's jewelry that hadn't been sold to pay for medicine. Sarah insisted that Margaret wear her own wedding dress, a simple cream-colored gown that had been carefully preserved in a trunk. That night, lying in bed for what would be the last time in this house, Margaret pressed her hands to her belly and thought about the enormous change her life was about to undergo. This morning, she had been alone and desperate. Tonight, she was engaged to a man she barely knew, about to become a rancher's wife. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She thought about Daniel, the man who had gotten her into this situation, and felt a surge of anger. He had made her promises, talked about building a life together, and then vanished without a word when his business here was done. She had been a fool to believe him, but she was learning that regret changed nothing. The only path was forward, and at least now she had someone willing to walk that path beside her. Ethan arrived at dawn as promised, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 strong horses. He had brought blankets and cushions to make the journey more comfortable for Sarah, and he handled her with gentle care as he helped her up onto the seat. Margaret climbed up beside her mother, and they set off through the quiet morning streets of Columbia toward Sonora. The ride took about 3 hours, and as they traveled, Ethan told them about his ranch. He had 150 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and 40 acres of decent grazing land. The house had 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a front porch that looked out over the hills. There was a vegetable garden that had gone wild without a woman to tend it, and a chicken coop that needed repairs. It sounds wonderful, Margaret said honestly. I'm good with gardens and I can fix the chicken coop. My father taught me basic carpentry before he died. Ethan glanced at her with approval. Useful skill. I could use an extra pair of hands for a lot of projects around the place. Do you have any help? Sarah asked. Ranch work is too much for 2 people, especially with Margaret in her condition. I have 2 hired hands, Miguel and his son Carlos, Ethan explained. They live in the bunkhouse and help with the cattle and heavy work. Good men, both of them. They've been with me for 3 years now. He paused. I should probably tell you that Miguel's wife lives with them too. Rosa is a wonderful cook, and she keeps the bunkhouse in order. She's been after me for years to get married, saying a man shouldn't live alone. She'll be thrilled to have another woman around. They arrived in Sonora just before noon. It was a larger town than Columbia, still bustling with commerce from its gold rush days. Ethan drove them straight to the courthouse, where the justice of the peace, a jovial man named Judge Henry Cooper, greeted Ethan like an old friend. "Ethan Foster, you finally decided to take the plunge, did you?" Judge Cooper clapped Ethan on the shoulder, then turned to Margaret with a warm smile. "And who is this lovely lady?" "This is Margaret Lawson," Ethan said. "And her mother, Sarah. We'd like to be married today if you're available." "For you, Ethan, always." Judge Cooper ushered them into his chambers, which doubled as a courtroom. "Do you have witnesses?" "I was hoping you might know someone," Ethan admitted. "No problem at all. Let me fetch my clerk and his wife. They're always happy to stand in." Judge Cooper disappeared for a moment and returned with a middle-aged couple who introduced themselves as Thomas and Ellen Richards. The ceremony was simple and brief, but Margaret found herself surprisingly moved by it. When Ethan took her hand and repeated his vows, his voice was steady and sure. When it was her turn, she looked into his eyes and promised to honor and cherish him, and meant every word. She might not love him yet, but she was profoundly grateful to him, and that felt like a good place to start. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Judge Cooper declared. "Ethan, you may kiss your bride." Ethan hesitated for just a moment, clearly unsure how to proceed, then leaned down and pressed a gentle, chaste kiss to Margaret's lips. It was brief and respectful, but Margaret felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with the baby. After the ceremony, Judge Cooper insisted on taking them to lunch at the hotel restaurant to celebrate. Over plates of roast beef and potatoes, he regaled them with stories about Ethan's father, whom he had apparently known well. "Thomas Foster was one of the finest men I ever met," Judge Cooper said, raising his glass. "He had a heart as big as the Sierra Nevada and a moral compass that never wavered. Ethan, you're very much your father's son. He'd be proud of you today." Ethan's expression grew soft with memory. "He taught me that love is a choice you make every day, not just a feeling that comes and goes. That a real man stands by his commitments, no matter what." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. She had married a good man, she realized. A truly good man. The journey back to the ranch took another 3 hours, and by the time they arrived, the sun was beginning to set. Margaret's first glimpse of her new home took her breath away. The house was indeed sturdy and well-built, constructed of wood with a stone chimney. It sat on a gentle rise, surrounded by rolling hills dotted with cattle. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and majestic in the fading light. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed. Ethan helped Sarah down from the wagon with careful hands. "Let me show you to your room, Mrs. Lawson. You must be exhausted." The inside of the house was clean but sparse, clearly the domain of a man living alone. The furniture was practical and well made, but there were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, none of the small touches that made a house a home. Margaret could already see a dozen ways to improve it, and her fingers itched to start. But first, her mother needed rest. Ethan showed Sarah to a bedroom on the ground floor, spacious and bright with windows that looked out over the garden. There was already a fire laid in the small fireplace, and Ethan lit it to chase away the evening chill. "I'll have Rosa bring you some supper," Ethan said to Sarah. "And tomorrow we'll send for the doctor to take a look at you." "You're very kind, Mr. Foster," Sarah said, settling into the bed with obvious relief. "My daughter is lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Ethan replied and squeezed Margaret's hand. He left to fetch Rosa while Margaret helped her mother get settled. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, she found Ethan in the kitchen, putting coffee on to boil. He looked up when she entered, and for the first time, she saw uncertainty in his expression. "I should show you the rest of the house," he said. "The master bedroom is upstairs. It's the largest room and it has the best view. I thought you might want it." He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I'll take one of the other bedrooms. I don't want you to feel pressured or uncomfortable. We barely know each other, and I know your condition is delicate. I'm willing to wait for the physical side of marriage until you're ready, whether that's weeks or months or longer." Margaret felt a rush of affection for this considerate man. "Thank you, Ethan. That means a great deal to me. I just want you to feel safe here," he said. "This is your home now, and I want it to be a happy one." Rosa arrived a few minutes later, a plump, energetic woman in her 40s with a long black braid and sparkling dark eyes. When Ethan introduced Margaret as his wife, Rosa let out a whoop of joy and immediately embraced Margaret, speaking in rapid Spanish that Margaret couldn't follow but understood was welcoming. "She's been telling me I need a wife since the day she arrived," Ethan said with a laugh. "She says a house without a woman is like a garden without rain." Rosa took over the kitchen with bustling efficiency, shooing Ethan out and chattering to Margaret in a mixture of Spanish and English. Within an hour, she had produced a hearty meal of chicken stew and fresh bread, along with tea for Sarah and strong coffee for Ethan. They ate at the kitchen table, and Margaret felt something warm settle in her chest. This was her family now. Her mother, her new husband, and the baby growing inside her. It was strange and new and nothing like she had imagined her life would be, but it felt right. That night, after Sarah was settled and Rosa had gone back to the bunkhouse, Ethan showed Margaret to the master bedroom. It was indeed spacious, with a large bed covered in a simple quilt, a dresser, and a wardrobe. The windows looked out over the hills, and Margaret could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I'll be just down the hall if you need anything," Ethan said from the doorway. "Sleep well, Maggie." "Ethan," Margaret turned to face him, "thank you for all of this, for giving me and my baby a chance when no one else would." He smiled, and in the lamplight he looked younger, almost boyish. "God doesn't make mistakes, remember, you and that baby were meant to be here." "I'm sure of it." After he left, Margaret changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed. The mattress was comfortable, the room was warm, and for the first time in months she felt safe. She pressed her hands to her belly and whispered to the life growing there, "It's going to be all right now. We have a home, and we have someone who cares about us. Everything is going to be all right." The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and activity. Margaret threw herself into making the house a proper home, sewing curtains for the windows and cushions for the chairs. She tended the garden, coaxing vegetables from the wild tangle it had become. She repaired the chicken coop with Ethan's help, and soon they had fresh eggs every morning. Sarah's health improved with regular meals and rest, and the color returned to her cheeks. The doctor Ethan brought out from Colombia declared her condition manageable with proper care and medication, which Ethan provided without complaint. Margaret and Ethan fell into an easy routine, working side by side during the day and talking by the fire in the evenings. She learned that he loved to read, that his favorite meal was apple pie, that he had a dry sense of humor that made her laugh. He learned that she sang while she worked, that she had a talent for sketching, that she was fiercely protective of the people she loved. They were becoming friends, Margaret realized, and friendship, she was discovering, was an excellent foundation for something more. It was about a month after the wedding when everything changed. Margaret was in the kitchen making bread when Reverend Thompson and two of the church elders arrived in a wagon. She saw them through the window and felt her stomach drop. Ethan was out on the range with Miguel and Carlos, and she was alone. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and went out to meet them, forcing herself to stand tall despite her fear. "Miss Lawson," Reverend Thompson said coldly, deliberately using her maiden name. "Or should I say, Mrs. Foster, I heard about your hasty marriage." "What can I do for you, Reverend?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice steady. "We've come to talk some sense into you and your husband," said Elder Morrison, a pinch-faced man who ran the bank. "It's not right what you've done, trapping a good man into marriage, forcing him to take on your shame." "I didn't trap anyone," Margaret said sharply. "Ethan proposed to me of his own free will." "A decent man would have been horrified by your situation," Reverend Thompson said. "The fact that he married you anyway speaks to either desperation or poor judgment. Either way, the church wants you to know that your status has not changed. You are still not welcome at services or gatherings." Before Margaret could respond, Ethan's voice rang out across the yard. "I think you gentlemen need to leave my property." He was striding toward them from the barn, and his expression was thunderous. Miguel and Carlos were right behind him, clearly having returned while the confrontation was taking place. "Mr. Foster," Reverend Thompson began, "we only came to express our concern for your immortal soul. This woman is a sinner, and by taking her in, you've aligned yourself with her sin." "My wife is not a sinner," Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She's a woman who made a mistake and was abandoned by the man responsible. She deserves compassion, not condemnation." "The Bible is very clear about fornication," Elder Morrison interjected. "The Bible is also very clear about judging others and casting the first stone," Ethan shot back. "But I don't see any of you worrying about that. You came out here to shame my wife in her own home, and I won't stand for it." "We're trying to help you see reason," Reverend Thompson insisted. "No, you're trying to make yourselves feel superior by tearing down someone who's already been hurt enough." Ethan moved to stand beside Margaret, his arm coming around her shoulders in a protective gesture. "Let me make something very clear. Maggie is my wife. This is her home. The child she's carrying will be my son or daughter in every way that matters, and if the church has a problem with that, then the church can stay away from my ranch." "You'll regret this, Foster," Elder Morrison warned. "Aligning yourself with this woman will cost you. People won't do business with you. You'll be seen as just as shameful as she is." "Then I guess we'll be shameful together," Ethan said evenly. "Now get off my land before I have Miguel escort you off." The three men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected such fierce resistance. They climbed back into their wagon and left, but not before Reverend Thompson called back, "You'll answer to God for this, Foster." "I'm not worried about that," Ethan called after them. "God doesn't make mistakes, and bringing Maggie into my life was no mistake." After they left, Margaret found she was shaking. Ethan guided her into the house and settled her into a chair by the fire. Rosa appeared with tea, clucking sympathetically in Spanish. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "I've brought you nothing but trouble." "No." Ethan knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. "You've brought light into this house. You've made it a home. You've given me a reason to look forward to coming in at the end of the day instead of dreading the emptiness." His gray-blue eyes were intense, searching her face. "Maggie, these past few weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. I don't care what the church says. I don't care what the town thinks. All I care about is you and your mother and the baby, and making sure you all have everything you need." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I think we found each other," Ethan said softly, and reached up to wipe her tears away with his thumb. "God doesn't make mistakes, remember." Something shifted between them in that moment, something deep and fundamental. Margaret leaned forward and Ethan met her halfway, and their kiss was nothing like the chaste peck at their wedding. This was real and warm and full of promise. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "Maggie, I think I'm falling in love with you." "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered back, and knew it was true. From that day forward, their relationship deepened. Ethan moved back into the master bedroom, and their marriage became a true partnership in every sense. He was endlessly patient with her changing body, gentle and considerate as her pregnancy progressed. At night, he would place his hand on her belly and talk to the baby, telling stories about the ranch and making plans for the future. "We'll teach him to ride," Ethan would say. "Or her, doesn't matter which, every foster learns to ride." "Foster," Margaret would repeat softly, marveling that her child would have that good, solid name instead of being born a bastard. As predicted, there were consequences for their defiance of the church. Some of Ethan's regular buyers refused to do business with him, and several invitations to social events were pointedly not extended. But there were also surprises. Judge Cooper sent a congratulatory letter and a set of silver spoons. Thomas and Ellen Richards, who had witnessed the wedding, visited the ranch and became fast friends. Several of the Mexican families who lived in the area, already socially marginalized themselves, went out of their way to offer support. And then there was Rosa, Miguel, and Carlos, who treated Margaret like family from the very beginning. Rosa became like a second mother, teaching Margaret recipes and sharing stories of her own life. Miguel, a quiet man with wise eyes, often left small gifts for Sarah, hand-carved animals and flowers that made the older woman smile. Carlos, who was 19 and shy, slowly came out of his shell, and Margaret discovered he had a beautiful singing voice. As the months passed, and Margaret's belly grew round and prominent, she found herself happier than she had ever been. The shame and fear that had dominated her life in Colombia faded away, replaced by contentment and love. She loved her home, she loved the wide open spaces and the big sky, and most of all she loved Ethan. He proved himself to be everything she could have wanted in a husband. He was kind and hardworking, patient and funny, affectionate and attentive. He never once made her feel like a burden or an obligation. Instead, he made her feel cherished, desired, valued. On a chilly November evening, Margaret went into labor. Ethan sent Carlos riding for the doctor while Rosa took charge with calm efficiency. Sarah held her daughter's hand and murmured encouragement. And Ethan paced the kitchen like a caged animal, absolutely beside himself with worry. The labor lasted through the night, and just as dawn was breaking, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When Rosa placed the squalling infant in Ethan's arms, his face transformed with wonder. "Hello, little one," he said softly, and the baby immediately quieted at the sound of his voice. "Welcome to the world. I'm your papa, and I'm going to love you every single day of your life." Margaret watched through exhausted, happy tears as Ethan brought the baby to her. She took her son in her arms and marveled at his tiny, perfect features, his shock of dark hair, his miniature fingers that gripped hers with surprising strength. "What should we name him?" Ethan asked, settling on the bed beside her. "Matthew," Margaret said without hesitation. It had been her father's name. "Matthew Foster. Matthew Foster," Ethan repeated, testing it out. "It's perfect. He's perfect. You're perfect." He kissed her forehead, then her lips. "Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for giving me a family. Thank you for giving us a home," Margaret replied, leaning into his warmth. The doctor arrived an hour later and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. After he left, Rosa brought them breakfast, and Sarah came in to meet her grandson. The tiny bedroom was crowded and warm and full of love. "He looks like you, Margaret," Sarah said, gently touching the baby's cheek. "But he has Ethan's chin." Margaret glanced at Ethan and saw the pride in his expression. It didn't matter that Matthew wasn't his biological child. In every way that mattered, this was his son. The weeks after Matthew's birth were exhausting but joyful. Ethan proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with Matthew when he cried at night. He built a beautiful cradle with his own hands, carving designs of horses and mountains into the wood. He was endlessly patient, endlessly loving, and Margaret fell more deeply in love with him every day. When Matthew was 3 months old, they received an unexpected visitor. Margaret was in the garden with the baby when a wagon pulled up the drive. She tensed, remembering the last unwelcome visit from church representatives, but relaxed when she saw it was Judge Cooper. "Mrs. Foster," he called out cheerfully. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was in the area and wanted to stop by and meet the new addition to the Foster family." Ethan came out of the barn and greeted the judge warmly, and they all went inside for coffee and cake. Judge Cooper was enchanted with Matthew, declaring him the finest-looking baby he had seen in years. "I also came with some news," Judge Cooper said, growing more serious. "It's about your situation with the church, Mrs. Foster. I've heard some disturbing things about how you were treated." Margaret stiffened, but Ethan took her hand reassuringly. "I want you to know that what happened to you was wrong," Judge Cooper continued. "Christian charity should mean something, and casting out a young woman in need is the opposite of Christian. I've spoken to several community leaders, and there's growing sentiment that Reverend Thompson overstepped his authority." "We don't need the church's approval," Ethan said firmly. "We're doing just fine on our own." "I understand that, and I respect it," Judge Cooper replied. "But I wanted you to know that not everyone agreed with how you were treated, Mrs. Foster. There are good people in Columbia who are ashamed of what happened. If you ever wanted to return to services, I believe you would find a warmer reception than you expect." Margaret considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "Thank you, Judge Cooper, but I think we've found our own way of worship out here. God is in the sunrise over the mountains and the sound of my baby's laughter and the way my husband looks at me. I don't need a building to feel close to the divine." Judge Cooper smiled. "Your mother would have said the same thing, Ethan. She had a very personal relationship with God, one that didn't require intermediaries." He stood to leave. "You've built something good here. Don't let anyone tell you different." After he left, Ethan pulled Margaret close. Matthew nestled between them. "Are you really content here? Away from town and church and society?" "I'm more than content," Margaret assured him. "I'm happy, Ethan, truly happy. For the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere." "You belong here," Ethan said, kissing the top of her head. "You belong with me." The seasons turned, and Matthew grew from a baby into a curious, energetic toddler. He took his first steps on the porch while Ethan cheered and Margaret cried happy tears. He said his first word, which was "Papa," and Ethan's expression of pure joy was something Margaret would treasure forever. Life on the ranch had its challenges. There were harsh winters when the cattle struggled, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. There were dry summers when water was scarce, and tempers ran short. There were sick animals and broken equipment, and 100 small disasters that required patience and perseverance. But through it all, Margaret and Ethan faced everything together. They worked side by side, laughed together, solved problems together, and loved each other more with each passing day. What had started as a marriage of convenience had transformed into a true love story, the kind that songs were written about. When Matthew was 2 years old, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. This time, there was no fear or shame, only joy and anticipation. Ethan was ecstatic, though he worried constantly about Margaret's health and made her promise to take things easy. "I went through this once already," Margaret reminded him with amusement. "I know what I'm doing." "I know, but I can't help worrying," Ethan said, his hand resting on her still flat belly. "You and Matthew and this new baby are my whole world." Their daughter was born in the spring of 1880, a tiny red-faced bundle with Margaret's green eyes and a remarkably loud cry. They named her Elizabeth, after Ethan's mother, and called her Eliza. Matthew was fascinated by his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to feeding time. Sarah, whose health had continued to improve with good care, doted on both grandchildren. She would sit in her rocking chair on the porch, Eliza in her arms and Matthew at her feet, and tell stories about Margaret's childhood. She looked younger than she had in years, happy and peaceful, and Margaret often thanked God for giving her mother this time to see her grandchildren grow. Rosa declared that the ranch was finally complete now that it had the sound of children's laughter filling it. Miguel carved wooden toys for Matthew and a beautiful rattle for Eliza. Carlos taught Matthew simple songs in Spanish, and the little boy would sing them at the dinner table, making everyone smile. One evening, when Eliza was about 6 months old, Margaret and Ethan sat on the porch watching the sunset while the children slept inside. Sarah had retired early, and the ranch was peaceful and quiet except for the distant lowing of cattle and the chirping of crickets. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Margaret asked, leaning against Ethan's shoulder. "Different how?" Ethan's arm came around her, holding her close. "If you hadn't been there that day, if you hadn't offered to help me." Margaret shuddered slightly. "I don't know what would have become of me and Matthew. But I was there," Ethan said firmly, "and I did help. And now we're here together with our family. That's what matters." "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked quietly. "Taking on someone else's child, the scandal, the way some people still treat us." Ethan turned to face her, his gray-blue eyes serious in the fading light. "Maggie, you and our children are the best thing that ever happened to me. I have never, not for one single moment, regretted marrying you. Matthew is my son in every way that matters. So is Eliza. And if we have a dozen more children, I'll love every single one of them just as much. A dozen." Margaret laughed. "Let's maybe aim for something a bit more reasonable." "Whatever you want," Ethan said, grinning. "Though I do enjoy the process of making babies with you." Margaret swatted his arm playfully, but she was smiling. "You're incorrigible." "And you love me anyway," Ethan replied, stealing a kiss. "I do," Margaret said softly. "I love you so much, Ethan, more than I ever thought possible." "I love you too, Maggie. You're my whole heart." They sat together as the stars came out, wrapped in each other's arms, and Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Her life hadn't turned out anything like she had planned. She had been betrayed, rejected, cast out by the very people who should have helped her. She had been scared and desperate and certain her life was over. But then Ethan had appeared, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. He had offered her not just a marriage of convenience, but a real partnership, a true family, a love that grew stronger every day. He had given her son a name and a father. He had given her mother a comfortable home in which to live out her days. And he had given Margaret herself a second chance at happiness. God doesn't make mistakes. Ethan had said that first day, and Margaret had clung to those words like a lifeline. Now, sitting on the porch of her home with her husband beside her and her children sleeping safely inside, she knew those words were true. None of this was a mistake. Not the baby she had carried in fear and shame, not the hasty marriage to a near stranger, not the difficult path that had led her here. It was all exactly as it was meant to be. The years continued to pass in a gentle rhythm of seasons and milestones. Matthew grew into a bright, energetic boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ways of the ranch. Eliza proved to have her mother's artistic talent, covering slate after slate with drawings of horses and mountains and her family. Sarah lived to see both grandchildren start their schooling, taught by Margaret in the ranch house kitchen, before passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 62. Margaret grieved her mother's loss, but took comfort in the fact that Sarah's last years had been happy ones. She had died knowing her daughter was loved and cared for, that her grandchildren were thriving, that the scandal that had once threatened to destroy everything had instead led to something beautiful. When Matthew was 8 and Eliza was 6, Margaret gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Samuel and Grace. The ranch was chaotic and loud and full of life, exactly the way Ethan had always dreamed it would be. They expanded the house to accommodate the growing family, adding more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The ranch prospered as well, with the herd growing steadily and a reputation for quality cattle that brought buyers from all over California. The scandal that had once threatened to ruin them faded into memory, replaced by respect for the family that had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. There were still some in Colombia who remembered and judged, but their numbers dwindled over the years. Reverend Thompson eventually retired, and his replacement was a younger, more compassionate man who made a point of welcoming all to his services, regardless of past mistakes. Margaret never did return to regular church attendance, preferring her own form of worship, but she appreciated the gesture. Judge Cooper remained a faithful friend, visiting several times a year and bringing gifts for the children. Miguel, Rosa, and Carlos became such integral parts of the family that when Carlos married a local girl named Maria, they built a second house on the property and started their own family. The ranch became a thriving community, bound together not by blood but by love and loyalty. On a warm summer evening in 1890, Margaret and Ethan celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary. The children, ranging in age from 10 to 16, had organized a surprise party with Rosa's help, complete with a cake and handmade decorations. Matthew, now a lanky teenager who looked remarkably like Ethan, made a toast. "To Mom and Dad," he said, raising his glass of lemonade. "Thank you for showing us what real love looks like. Thank you for teaching us that family is about more than blood. It's about choosing to stand by each other no matter what. And Dad, thank you for being the best father any of us could ask for." Margaret saw tears glisten in Ethan's eyes, and her own vision blurred. Matthew knew the truth about his parentage. They had told him when he turned 12, wanting him to hear it from them rather than from gossip or speculation. He had listened quietly, then hugged Ethan and said, "You're still my dad. You always will be." After the party, when the children were finally in bed and the house was quiet, Margaret and Ethan walked out to their favorite spot on the porch. The view had never changed in all their years there. The rolling hills, the distant mountains, the vast starry sky overhead. 12 years, Margaret marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've been together forever. "I prefer forever," Ethan said, pulling her close. "I plan on keeping you around for at least another 50 years. 50 years, Margaret laughed. "That would make us both very old. I don't care. I'll love you when we're old and gray and sitting on this porch in our rocking chairs, watching our grandchildren play." Margaret rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day, when you asked me to marry you?" "I said a lot of things," Ethan replied. "Most of them probably pretty awkward. You said God doesn't make mistakes, Margaret reminded him. You said every child is a blessing, no matter how it comes into the world. You said every person deserves compassion and second chances. I meant every word, Ethan said softly. I know you did. And those words saved my life, Ethan. They saved Matthew's life. They gave us all of this. Margaret gestured to the ranch spread out before them, to the home they had built together. I was so scared that day, so certain everything was ending, but it was really just beginning. The best chapter of my life began the day I met you, Ethan said, tilting her face up to kiss her. You made me believe in love, real love, the kind that lasts. You gave me a family and a purpose and a reason to be grateful every single day. I love you, Margaret whispered against his lips. I love you more than words can say. I love you too, Maggie. Always have, always will. They stood together under the stars, two people who had found each other in the midst of crisis and built a life beyond their wildest dreams. The church had rejected her. Society had judged her. But Ethan had seen past the scandal to the woman underneath. He had offered her not just rescue but partnership. Not just a name for her child but a father who loved him. Not just a home but a family. And in return, Margaret had given Ethan everything she had. Her loyalty, her love, her laughter, her strength. She had transformed his lonely ranch house into a warm, welcoming home. She had filled his days with purpose and his nights with love. She had given him children to raise and a reason to build a legacy. Together, they had proven that love doesn't always follow the rules. Sometimes it comes in unexpected packages, at unexpected times, in unexpected ways. Sometimes it requires courage to claim it, strength to defend it, and faith to believe in it. But when it's real, when it's true, when it's the kind of love that God Himself ordains, nothing can stand against it. Not judgment, not scandal, not the passing of time. As the years continued to unfold, the Foster family became a fixture in the Sierra Nevada foothills, known for their generosity, their strong values, and the love that bound them together. Matthew grew up to take over the ranch, running it with the same integrity his father had taught him. Eliza became a teacher, using her artistic talents to inspire the next generation. The twins, Samuel and Grace, found their own paths, but both remained close to home and family. And through it all, through every triumph and challenge, every joy and sorrow, Margaret and Ethan stood together. They grew old together, exactly as Ethan had predicted, sitting on their porch in their rocking chairs and watching their grandchildren, and eventually their great-grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once run. People often ask them the secret to their long, happy marriage. Ethan always had the same answer. Love is a choice you make every day. You choose to be patient, to be kind, to forgive, to try again. And if you're lucky enough to find someone worth choosing, you hold on tight and never let go, Margaret would add. And remember that God doesn't make mistakes. Every twist and turn in your path, even the ones that seem like disasters at the time, can lead you exactly where you need to be. On a golden autumn afternoon in 1925, Ethan Foster passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76, his wife of 47 years holding his hand. Margaret wept, but they were not tears of regret. How could she regret a single moment of the life they had shared? At his funeral, Matthew stood before the gathered crowd and told the story of how his parents met, how a cowboy with a kind heart had rescued a desperate young woman and her unborn child. He told them about the words that had become their family motto: God doesn't make mistakes. My father taught me that love is action, not just feeling, Matthew said, his voice thick with emotion. He showed me what it means to be a man of integrity, to stand by your principles even when it costs you. He proved that family is about choice and commitment, not just blood. And he loved us all, every single day of his life, with a steadiness and devotion that never wavered. Margaret lived another 5 years, surrounded by the family that Ethan had helped her build. She spent her final years telling stories to her great-grandchildren, passing down the lessons she had learned, ensuring that Ethan's legacy of love and compassion would continue for generations to come. When she died in her sleep at the age of 73, she was buried beside Ethan under a spreading oak tree on a hill overlooking the ranch. The headstone read, "Margaret and Ethan Foster, beloved husband and wife, parents and grandparents. God doesn't make mistakes." And in the end, that was the truth that defined their lives. What had seemed like a terrible mistake, a devastating error, a life-destroying scandal, had actually been the beginning of something beautiful. Margaret's unplanned pregnancy had led her to Ethan. Ethan's compassion had led him to Margaret. And together, they had built a love story that would inspire their descendants for generations to come. They had proved that grace is stronger than judgment, that love is more powerful than scandal, and that sometimes the most unexpected blessings come wrapped in packages we never would have chosen for ourselves. They had showed the world that second chances are real, that redemption is possible, and that with courage and faith and the right person beside you, you can overcome anything. Their great-great-grandchildren still live on that ranch in the Sierra Nevada foothills, still raising cattle and tending the land that Ethan and Margaret built together. The house has been expanded and modernized, but the original structure still stands, a testament to the foundation that was laid so many years ago. And on quiet evenings, when the sun sets over the mountains and the stars begin to appear, family members still gather on that porch and tell the story of how it all began. They tell of a young woman in desperate circumstances and a cowboy with a compassionate heart. They tell of a wedding performed in haste but sustained by love. They tell of judgment faced and overcome, of obstacles conquered, of a family built on choice rather than chance. And they always end the story the same way, with the words that started it all, the words that became their legacy, the words that proved true in ways Ethan could never have imagined when he first spoke them. God doesn't make mistakes.